They told me revenge was messy. They said it burned you alive at both ends until there was nothing left but ash and regret. They were wrong. Or maybe they were right once, for other people. For me, Revenge was a carefully edited novel. Each chapter planned, each scene rehearsed, every unreliable narrator placed exactly where I needed them. My name is Grace. For the man who broke me, it would be a story he never wanted to read. Ethan and I met in a city that promised reinvention. He had the kind of smile that fit mid-century photographs. Easy, practiced, the kind that made strangers comfortable and friends quick. He was a project manager for a tech startup, an expert at spinning risk into opportunity. I fell for that talent, the way he could find patterns where I saw only noise, how he could make me believe in improbable things. We were married 3 years later in a small park under trees that lined the river like sentinels. We painted the apartment ourselves, argued about paint swatches like trivia champions, and timesheets of his life fit neatly into ours. For a long time I thought I loved him because he made me certain of things. Then he made me certain of nothing. The first clue arrived as a change in the rhythm of our mornings. He used to leave kisses like small transactions. Forehead, cheek, back of my hand. Those disappeared. Notes replaced them. Little post-it saying, lunch, or back late. I blamed work. Who wouldn't? I catalogued the excuses, deadlines, client dinners, a faultless treadmill of corporate life. I perfected the art of believing. It took photographs to begin the unraveling. I found them in a digital photo stream he left open on our shared tablet. An enormous kindness, a small arrogance. There, neatly arrayed, were images of a woman who was not me. Hair that fell in dangerous waves, a laugh caught mid-swoon, hands clasping his as if tethering him to the world. They were the kind of pictures people take when they are not trying to hide anything, and that in itself was confession. The timestamps were shuffled, as if to avoid pattern, but a stubborn thing called metadata told the truth. Restaurant names, addresses. A hotel chain he'd never mentioned in 2 years of complaining together about bad room service. I froze, that peculiar way time behaves when a fault line opens beneath you. Everything small, the coffee cup he left at the sink, the way he hummed when he was thinking, compressed into a single bright shard of betrayal. I could have shown him the photographs and watched his face collapse into apologies that would have seemed as genuine as everything else had once been. I could have packed a bag and left, the cliché of dignity. But I had always been a slow burn person, which meant I was not good at catharsis. I needed architecture. What followed was not violent. There would be no knives in this story, no choking scenes meant to titillate. My revenge would be a machine, elegant, cruel in its precision, built to expose and to punish by dismantling the very things he used to hide. Narrative, reputation, and control. First, I became invisible. I learned the routes he took to the office. I walked them at odd hours, notebook in hand, the way students copy lines from a book. I learned the cafes he favored when he needed time alone, the florist 2 blocks over that sold peonies he claimed not to like. I learned signatures, the way his pen left a sliver of pressure on the letter A, how he abbreviated certain names. I compiled habits like evidence. My notebook became a map of the life he thought he could run uninterrupted. At night, I practiced my voice. I recorded myself speaking, weaving lies into a cadence of truth. I needed to be unremarkable in speech because the most lethal instrument I'd choose was believability. If I sounded absurd, if my anger leaked into melodrama, he would shrug, call me wounded, and the world that believed his smile would side with him. I needed the exact suffocating stillness of truth that comes when someone else hears a piece of their life described and understands, with helplessness, that it is the truth. Then I gathered allies. Not friends in the glittering romantic sense. Allies were people whose dissatisfaction intersected with my plan. There was Mara, the woman with a haircut like a file and a contempt for anything half-truth. She ran a boutique PR firm and owed me favors because I'd once cautioned her against hiring the wrong accountant. There was Jonah, a freelance photographer whose work I had admired in a gallery, and who had a knack for making things look true on paper. There was also Lila, Ethan's assistant, the one he praised for her competence while he mistook competence for discretion. Lila was a quiet person with a stubborn moral compass. She had been unnerved long before I was. The quietness in her eyes had always told me she held discomfort like a seed waiting to sprout. I handed each of them a role, and like good actors, they accepted without question. The wonderful thing about revenge is how it allows you to be the director. I watched them take scenes I wrote and make them seamless. My first public move, a subtle discredit. Ethan's company had a board meeting scheduled. A glossy, confident showcase of growth metrics and strategic bravado. I knew the CEO. Tom, a man whose vanity required mirrors and shareholders. I sent Tom a dossier compiled in a single evening, nothing defamatory, nothing illegal, just a series of coincidences and questions with neat arrows pointing to Evelyn. That was the name on the receipts, and the hotel names. The dossier ended with a question. Could such distractions be affecting his leadership? I did not expect fireworks. The board was cautious, as boards are, wrapped in legal pads and risk aversion. But the seed was planted. A whisper of investigation began that looked like prudence. Ethan, who had always been able to explain away late nights and half-truths with clever analogies and a calculating blink, began to sweat. He asked me, quietly, as if we were still conspirators in the slightest wrong, whether I knew anything about the rumors. I gave him a smile he once told me was dangerous. Warm and entirely indifferent. Then came the smaller, personal collapses. I created an account on a social platform he used. Not to shame him with posts or public scenes, that would be amateurish, but to craft a series of messages to Evelyn that suggested a life I knew she valued. Privacy, connections, leverage. I did it with Jonah's photographs. Jonah took a picture of a table with 2 wine glasses and a napkin. Nothing incriminating, nothing explicit. He used filters that gave context without accusation. I sent these messages not to start a fight, but to create a pattern. The kind that makes a woman in a relationship with a married man ask questions she might not have asked otherwise. If she needed leverage, if she needed to protect herself, she would act in ways that would render Ethan vulnerable. I put my hand inside that system like a slow-turning key. One night, late, Ethan came home and found the small, innocent things rearranged. My coat, which he liked to drape over the back of a chair, was folded over the banister. His favorite mug, the chipped blue one he would scold for its imperfections, had been replaced with a plain paper cup. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I was working on my novel, and his brow unfurrowed because he liked to imagine me as a woman of orderly obsessions. I also became his reflection. I started returning the favor of partial truths. When he said he'd been at the office until 2, I told him I had slept early. When he texted him a photo of a sunset and a line about, "finally here," I kept my voice calm, asked which beach. He said something small offhand. Bridgemont. I looked that place up, learned about its boutique hotels, found the name of the one that matched the metadata in the photos I had found. I did nothing dramatic. Instead, I waited. Important parts of revenge are patience and the use of someone's own self-image against them. Ethan prided himself on being meticulous. He kept receipts, logs, little annotations of travel. I began to plant the appearance of order. I left a draft of an email visible on my laptop about financials and discrepancies, never sending it, just letting it sit like a baited trap. That tiny, innocent artifact allowed Jonah to make images and allowed Mara to whisper to someone who knew someone. The board called for a formal audit. In the audit scope, a line item appeared. Travel expenses flagged for explanation. Ethan's face, which had never been used to being called to account by strangers, grew taut. If you have ever watched a houseplant wither, you know the patience of withholding light. I gave Ethan the same sensation. He was not a violent man, but he was a man who needed control. My small acts were invisible yanks on the strings he held tight. He tightened them until his hands shook. The pivotal moment arrived the evening of his company's small gala. A celebration disguised as a fundraiser. It was the sort of event that important people attend when they want their sense of significance polished. The press would be there. Lila would be there. So would Tom. I had arranged, in a way that felt both delicate and merciless, for Evelyn to be present. She arrived late, not as a fury of accusations but as a composed stranger with a phone and a smile that never reached her eyes. She sat on the opposite side of the hall from Ethan, and when she gestured to Jonah, who posed as a vendor photographing the event, Jonah captured a single image. Ethan mid-laugh, his arm across Evelyn's shoulders. It was a picture that required no caption. It could be read by anyone who knew the grammar of intimacy. I watched my husband from across the room. He saw the flash and went still, like a dog hearing a predator's hiss. He did not storm the stage. He did not shout. He stumbled back to our table and tore at his napkin like a child. I watched him shrink, and inside me, something tender and dangerous smiled. That night, the story spread not with the heat of a scandal but with the quiet, clean antiseptic of evidence. Jonah's photograph found its way to a set of eyes that had the capacity to move reputations. Mara's client, a columnist who fetishized the collapse of the worthy. Mara sent the image, asking about context. The columnist, smelling a narrative of hypocrisy, published an op-ed about fidelity and power. The board called an emergency meeting. Ethan's apologies arrived in a flood the next morning, each one smaller than the last. He wanted me to be the audience that absolved him. He wanted me to become the voiceless proof of his normality. But I had already rewritten the last chapters. People think revenge is about breaking someone. They imagine the satisfying moment of violence. But there is a more intimate satisfaction in exposure, in forcing someone to live inside the truth they denied. The board suspended him pending investigation. Tom, whose mirrors were suddenly cracked, cancelled the fundraiser. Clients began to thin their patronage. Clients, as it turns out, do not like to be associated with men whose private lives have become headlines. And yet the personal part of my plan required more than reputation ruin. A reckoning feels incomplete if it only occurs outside the home. I wanted him to feel the small desertion of the things that had built his life. Trust, complacency, the assumption that the person beside him would always be the same. I began to leave things behind that mattered. Not sacred things, things that built a life. I converted our bookshelf into a display of his notes, the sticky notes he used to jot ideas, the favorite passages he had loved from books he claimed to read for me. I rearranged the photos on our mantel so that faces he had admired were removed. I didn't burn them or smash anything. I simply made them unavailable, as if memory itself could be locked in a glass box he had lost the key to. He confronted me after the board meeting, voice raw. "What are you doing?" he asked. His indignation had a disbelieving edge, like someone discovering that the floor had become quicksand. "I'm making you feel what you made me feel," I said. The words were not triumphant. They were procedural, the way a doctor tells a patient the name of their condition. "You make choices. They have consequences. You're destroying me," he said. "No," I folded my arms. "You destroyed us." There were moments during that period when I felt cruel. The world we had built together, the shared rituals, the habit of finishing each other's sentences, thinned like wallpaper. But cruelty and justice are not the same thing. Cruelty is arbitrary. Justice is proportional. I kept rechecking my plan like a mathematician verifying a proof. I was careful to be precise. And then, when his life seemed to narrow to the size of a headline, something unexpected happened. He tried to rewrite the narrative. He called friends, offered explanations, suggested that the photographs were staged, that the hotel was for a corporate retreat. He said things out loud that were true in the technical sense and false in the moral one. But lies can be dressed as truths if people are ready to believe. In many ways, that was my moment of danger. If he could convince others that the net I had woven was just a bureaucratic misunderstanding, my victory would evaporate. So I struck a different blow. I went public with a truth that required no photographs, no corroboration beyond my voice. I wrote an op-ed, signed, not anonymous. Not a long melodramatic piece but a careful account of how duplicity works. I wrote about the slow break of trust, the molecules of betrayal, the way it rearranges a life's furniture. I used my voice not to accuse him of specifics that would invite litigation and defensiveness, but to talk instead about the ethics of private choices that have public cost. I used language that felt like a therapy session. Deliberate, dispassionate, precise. The op-ed landed like a stone in still water. Readers rippled outward, some angry at the exposure, some compassionate. Crucially, Lila, whom I had coaxed gently with Jonah's help, came forward with a stapled neat packet of dates and emails. She did not speak in the sensationalist shriek of scandal, but in the quiet voice of a woman who had watched a moral stain bloomed into a leak. Her testimony did not accuse with heat. It provided a timeline. When combined with the photograph and the audit, it was airtight. The board had no choice. Ethan was fired. He packed his bags like a man who had been told to leave a rented room. There was no dramatic screaming. That had been reserved for the press. He left his toothbrush, his shirts, the small items that make a life recognizable. He wrote me a letter. 2 pages, tight and earnest. He asked for forgiveness. He asked me to remember the good things. I read the letter twice and then burned it in the apartment's fireplace. There is a particular smell to paper turning to ash. Sweet, carried slightly by the draft, like the end of a book. People ask me now whether I felt victorious in the moment of his departure. The feeling was not of triumph so much as a slow, clarifying quiet. When you remove toxic water from a glass, the glass remains. The water leaves. I was not changed into a different person. The person who had been dimmed returned to herself. I felt the return of light. But my revenge, as I had designed it, did not end with his professional ruin. He needed to be made harmless where he had been most dangerous. In the courtroom of relationships where he had believed himself above consequence. He tried to fight. He hired a lawyer who sent letters about defamation and privacy. He complained to friends and cursed the press. He attempted to salvage the remnants of his reputation by spinning narratives that made him a victim of gossip. It was a tactic as old as reputations themselves. It hinged, always, on other people's willingness to forgive. I had anticipated this. The last piece of my plan was simple, and perhaps the meanest. I took back the narrative of my life. I began to publish small things, not op-eds or declarations, but the daily acts that show someone rebuilding. Dinners with friends, the couch I reupholstered, the garden I planted on our balcony. I did not post to shame him. I posted to prove to myself that happiness could be an honest, small thing. Over time, people stopped asking questions. They observed in their own private ways and decided not to make noise. Some reached out, tentatively, to say they had been in similar places. Lila found a job at a non-profit and sent me a photograph of her first paycheck. Jonah had his gallery show. Mara expanded her firm. I traveled with a friend to a coastal town and learned to read waves like a kinder weather map. Ethan reappeared once months later, at a small coffee shop near where we used to take our evening walks. He sat across from me without asking, as if entitlement could buy a seat. His face had thinned. There was a humility in the way he talked then, like a man fumbling with a new language. "You got what you wanted," he said. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had rehearsed regrets. "I got what I needed." I stirred my coffee. We spoke for an hour about trivialities, the pastry selection, the city's new garbage trucks, a mutual acquaintance's wedding. He thanked me for leaving when I did. He said he was learning things about himself. He looked like a man who had been emptied to be refilled. When I walked away from that table, I felt neither triumph nor malice. There is a kind of peace in the aftermath of careful revenge. It is not the pyre and torch we imagine in novels. It is more like the quiet after a storm, the work of rebuilding with deliberate hands. I had not sought to destroy Ethan's life for the spectacle of it. I had sought restoration for my own, and in so doing I had dismantled the machine by which he hid. People ask what I regret. I have 3 answers. First, I regret the cost. Relationships, even broken ones, do not come without collateral. Friends were pulled into the current I made. Lila paid a price for choosing to speak. I cannot pretend that the justice that felt so clean for me did not bruise others. I would not change the outcome, but I hold the bruise in my memory as if it were a map of what to avoid again. Second, I regret that it took me so long. The slow, clinical machinery of evidence took time to construct. If I had confronted him sooner, perhaps things would have been shorter and less complicated. But we are not who we might be in the abstract. We are the products of time and choice. Third, I regret that I once needed him to teach me how to be decisive. The old Grace was tentative. The new Grace, the one who learned to speak in the language of consequences, is decisive because she must be. That lesson is not something I would give back. In the months since I wrote. It was not the catharsis of a public screed but the private kind. Journals with Marginalia, a novel that begins with a woman who learns the economy of anger and the ethics of exposure. I taught myself to love the ordinary in a way that did not feel like settling. I learned to set boundaries as if they were physical walls. Practical, necessary, not ornamental. People often romanticize the act of winning in revenge as though the victor returns unchanged. But victory, as I learned it, is a clearing. It is the removal of the rot so new things can grow. There is a difference between triumph and repair. Triumph is a shout. Repair is a long, unglamorous series of small, honest acts. Every so often I pass the cafe where he waits for the bus. We avoid each other's eyes. I have not told the whole story to anyone in detail. Some things are the private property of those who lived them. But in the quiet places of my daily life I have found a strange, steady contentment. I sleep without waiting for a phone buzz at midnight. I drink coffee that has no foreign smell. I read books that are not bookmarked with his notes. When I tell this story now, in the safe prism of years, It is not to boast but to explain that vengeance does not need to be an incendiary act. It can be a deliberate architecture. Plans made with care, allies gathered with respect, evidence built like a scaffolding. I won not by destroying a man but by dismantling the structures that allowed him to hide. I won by finding my voice and refusing to let the world of polite things, the boardrooms and the gala dinners and the polite smiles, decide what is true. Ethan lives somewhere with less sunlight. His phone rarely rings with the sorts of calls that once fed his arrogance. He has rebuilt, small and quiet, and perhaps he has learned to be ordinary. I hope so, because ordinary can be kinder than fame. As for me, Grace, I am learning new languages. I plant lavender on the balcony and wake early to see the way light slides across the river. Sometimes I pass a window and see my reflection, stronger, lined with a few new truths. I have become a person who no longer mistakes another's affections for their loyalty. I have learned the sharp, useful economy of saying no. If you ask whether I recommend revenge, I will give you a different answer than the one I would have given a decade ago. I will tell you that some things cannot be repaired with affection alone. I will tell you that dignity is a structure you defend. But I will also tell you, with the clear voice of someone who has walked through it, that staying human in the process matters. You can be ruthless and still keep your ethics. You can be clever without being cruel. They told me revenge would burn me alive. Maybe for some it does. For me, it was a slow unpeeling that revealed the person I had been under the ash. I am not unscarred, but the scars are mine, and they have the honest geometry of survival. I am Grace. I took back my life. I did not love less for it. I loved better. It was not the end, not really. Stories never end the way you expect. They fold differently, like maps you thought you'd read once and then discover have secret folds, new routes. After Ethan left, the world rearranged itself in small, stubborn ways. The apartment breathed, the plants I hated and loved thrived, and I learned how to move through rooms with my own steps, not the echo of his shoes. Still, even cleared glass carries fingerprints. In the weeks that followed, I kept a ritual. I opened the curtains at 6, made coffee the way my mother used to. Too strong, black, the kind that makes the corners of your mouth sting, and read the morning pages I'd promised myself I would write. Those first pages were messy. Names bled into metaphors. I wrote about the way trust feels when it is taken piece by piece. Like a wardrobe emptied of clothes, until you realize it's the air that was holding shape. Writing at first was a combing. Getting tangles out of my head. Later it became a map. I spoke to Lila twice a month. She would bring me small things, a box of mixed tea from a market she'd found, a print of a photograph Jonah had taken of the river in winter. She was steady in a way that felt necessary. We never got sentimental about the cost. That would have been a kind of cheap consolation. When she told me about the non-profit job and the first night she'd slept without fearing an email from Ethan, I felt a soft, unexpected tenderness. It was not for me alone. It was for the ripples I had started and the human faces they landed on. Jonah's gallery show was one of those small human triumphs that felt like the world suturing itself. I went and watched as strangers murmured over photographs that somehow made loneliness beautiful. He had a print of the two of us at the gala. Not the incriminating one, but another. The one where I am across the room with a slight, unreadable expression and Ethan's laughter caught like a little comet. Jonah had taken it because he liked the geometry of people in a room. Seeing it now, years later, I thought about perspective. How a single tilt of the camera can make a moment mean something completely different. Mara kept doing what she did best. She made other people's crises into narratives that served them. Her firm grew. She called once to tell me she'd landed a client who insisted on hiring the person who had once snubbed them. A small, delicious turn. Her voice on the phone was always a little metallic, the professional sheen of someone who sells control. I liked her for it. She had learned, as I had, that control is sometimes a currency you spend to buy breathing room. People ask me if I blamed Evelyn. That question always arrived like someone expecting a neat moral. Evelyn, I learned through the drifts of Jonah's notes and the occasional rumor, was complicated. She was not the cartoonish other woman some tabloids liked to paint. She was both victim and actor, someone who'd made choices within the confines of her own survival and desires. We never met formally. I suppose in my initial plan we had no need. My revenge was never about prosecuting another woman. It was about taking away the mechanism Ethan used to hide. Sometimes, on slow afternoons, I would walk to the gallery where Jonah had his studio and sit with him as he edited images. He had a way of making light look honest. He told me, once between the hum of a laptop and the soft snip of a pair of scissors, that he'd kept one of the gala photographs aside. "You should have it," he said. "Not as evidence. As a thing." I accepted it because things, even those that hurt you, become part of the mosaic. I hung it on a wall in my bedroom where sunlight hit it at dawn and made the image less precise, as if memory itself softened when it warmed. There were nights my chest tightened as if someone had wrapped a band around it. I'd wake from dreams where Ethan and I were still constructing a life together, painting swatches of color at midnight, arguing about tiles, and the dream would slide, like a film catching on a spool, into the moment of discovery. Photographs on the tablet, the metadata, the slow certainty that someone you loved someone else too. In those hours my hand would find the point where the scar was and trace it, not to reopen it, but to remind myself of where I had been. That's the thing about trauma and triumph. They share geography. Months later, Mara called me one evening, and her voice had the kind of breathlessness that isn't always about excitement. "There's something you should see," she said. I met her at her office, a glossy room with plants that were suspiciously alive. She slid a single newsprint across the table. An investigative piece about another executive at a firm similar to Ethan's, caught in a different scandal. Reading it, I felt something unwind. Not for him, but because the world seemed suddenly less singularly concerned with my small war. It was a useful reminder. Human beings repeat patterns until someone teaches them otherwise. Ethan tried, in fits and starts, to sew something back together. He attended therapy, apparently, because once a mutual acquaintance asked me if I would be willing to provide a reference. The sort of polite test people perform when they suspect someone reforms. I didn't lie. I told the truth. That he was capable of warmth and also of selective blindness. The acquaintance thanked me as though I had given an objective report and not delivered a verdict. It felt merciful to be candid. One slow autumn day, the trees shedding light like coins, Ethan found me at a talk I was giving about the ethics of storytelling. It felt odd to be held as an authority on narrative when, for years, I had been enacting one. He sat 3 rows back, looking small in a blazer he'd once used to make himself look important. After the talk, he approached politely, as a man approaching a shrine. "You were incisive," he said. "I wanted to thank you." "You read my piece," I said. He nodded. I did. It changed how I think about some things. There was something in his eyes that night. Not apology exactly, but a weight. Maybe it was humility. Maybe it was the fatigue of someone who had been stripped of an assumed altitude. I told him I hoped the change was lasting. "It is," he said. "I'm trying." Trying is the verb that carries the story forward. The world doesn't collapse into absolutes. It reforms into continuations. In time I stopped expecting him to teach me lessons. Instead, I learned to see the evidence of change in smaller things. A thoughtful email sent at a reasonable hour, a referral he made to Lila for a job at a consulting firm, a comment on Jonah's page praising a photograph without attaching a sermon. And then, in a way that surprised me, life supplied a twist I had not anticipated. A man named Daniel. Daniel was, by all accounts, an ordinary person with a steady job and a laugh that didn't try too hard. We met at a mutual friend's dinner, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and an oven that smelled of rosemary. He was curious, asked questions, and did not attempt to astonish me with anecdotes. Our first conversation lasted till after midnight. He asked me about small things. Favorite books, the smell that made me nostalgic, rather than probing into my past. There was a quiet patience to him that felt like a country lane. Predictable and safe, the sort of place you can finally stop pretending to be something else. I dated him awkwardly at first, like a person relearning how to walk. I was hypervigilant, watching for patterns that resembled Ethan's. He, to his credit, had an awkwardness he was comfortable owning. "I am not perfect," he said on our 4th date, handing me a pastry that had the audacity to be too sweet. "I don't want to be someone's project." That sentence, simple, honest, was a small miracle. It signaled the difference between people who perform themselves and people who arrive as they are. Daniel did not require me to be anyone but Grace. When I told him, much later, about the sequence of events that had unspooled my life, he listened as someone who heard but did not attempt to fix. There is grace in being held where you are, not being remade. There were other aftershocks. A defamation lawsuit that never materialized. A former client of Ethan's who emailed to apologize and then never followed up. The press moved on because it always does. New bloodlines of scandal demanded attention. The boards of other companies tightened their ethical policies. Though whether restraint followed intent or merely image, I could not say. On a winter morning, months after I'd lit the letter that had been his apology, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small key on a leather thong and a note. For the plants. The handwriting was unfamiliar. I pressed the key to my palm and felt the strange, small rush of being guarded and unguarded at once. I did not trace its origin. Sometimes the world tosses you relics to keep, with no instruction manual. I did not become immune to the temptation of construction. I built a garden, friendships, small rituals. I wrote a novel that folded in the ethics of observation. A woman who learns how to make evidence speak without weaponizing it. The manuscript was messy and honest and, in the end, published in a small press. Reviews were kind in the way small things are kind. A reader wrote to me saying that my book had taught her the language to speak to her husband about things she'd been afraid to name. That letter made up for a lot of nights of insomnia. If there is a finality to revenge, it is a fiction. Life is stubbornly open-ended. The machinery I had built to exact justice did not grant me the omniscience I had once sought in the act of exposure. It did, however, teach me discernment. I learned how to say no early, to refuse the drift toward complacency. I learned to put borders around my time and my affection as if they were physical fences. Not to keep people out for the sake of isolation, but to make space for the people who chose to remain inside honestly. Sometimes, at dusk, I stand at the balcony and watch the river take light away. It moves like a sentence finishing. It is inevitable and strangely consoling. I think of Ethan not with bitterness now but with a complicated pulse of pity and relief. Pity because the person who can betray is a person who is still learning to be whole. Relief because my life at last belonged to me. The story kept going. That, after all, is how stories are supposed to behave. They continue, not because the past is undone, but because the present keeps making new shapes out of the pieces. I am Grace. I keep planting lavender. I keep watering the plants. I keep writing sentences that, sometimes I cannot tear out. And when I look back at the map I kept in a battered notebook, the one with the routes and the sticky notes and the small, clinical diagrams of how a life can be rerouted, I do not see only vengeance. I see a cartographer who learned to chart safer territories, who learned the value of evidence, and learned finally, the courage it takes to remain gentle.